Our final session today, we changed gears a little bit. Up until this point, our focus has been, and as a historian I can say rightly, our focus has been on the history of the coast. We have looked at the histories of our indigenous peoples, Spanish missionaries, planters, timbermen, Gullah, Geechee, Low Country Creole histories, Igbo history, and even those most remote and far distant aliens, Yankee industrialists. Yes. With this session by Janice Ray, we're changing directions. Janice is a writer of considerable standing. This past November, she was inducted into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, joining a long list of distinguished authors that includes Sidney Lanier, Margaret Mitchell, Flannery O'Connor, and Martin Luther King Jr. Maybe you've heard of some of them. She is thus a writer of considerable standing, as well as an environmental activist, and she has authored 5 books of literary nonfiction and a collection of nature poetry. Her memoir, Ecology of a Cracker Childhood, was a New York Times notable book and chosen as the book all Georgians should read. She won the Southeastern Booksellers Award for Nonfiction in 1999, Southern Booksellers Award for Poetry in 2011, an American Book Award in 2000, the Southern Environmental Law Center Award for Outstanding Writing, and a Southern Book Critics Circle Award. She holds an MFA degree from the University of Montana and was awarded an honorary doctorate from Unity College in Maine. She has been a visiting professor and scholar in residence at several colleges and universities. She was a Woodrow Wilson Visiting Fellow, and she was the John and Renee Grisham Writer and Resident Fellow at the University of Mississippi. This afternoon, Janice will speak to us about how, as a writer, she has discovered a sense of place in the literature of the coast from William Bartram to contemporary writers. So please, join me in welcoming Janice Ray.
The power and brilliance in this room is remarkable. It's magnificent. I am quite overwhelmed by you guys. I also have so many friends here. So let me take an opportunity to thank Dr. Paul Presley for inviting me to be part of the symposium, and also all the people who organized it, including Robin Gunn and Elizabeth Dubose. Also, the book part, I'm very much looking forward to working with one of my heroes, who is Paul Sutter, on the book. And I thank all of you for giving up what is outside, a gorgeous day, to stay inside and hear me talk a little bit about sense of place. Wherever humans gather to live, we begin to tell stories about those places. And these stories serve to form as catchments, collective narratives from which a culture springs, culture being a quiver of stories that explain the way of life of a group of people, their behavior, values, symbols, beliefs, and which are passed between generations. Culture allows inhabitants to become, as Wallace Stegner writes in his famous essay called A Sense of Place, lovers of known earth, known weathers, and known neighbors, both human and non-human, although in many ways a sense of place can only be talked about as artifactual. The stories of the Georgia coast stretch back to the first humans who slipped through the ancient maritime forests and brackish marshes, but until the early 18th century, these narratives were, for the most part, as far as we can discern, unwritten or at least unsalvaged from the wreck of history. Centuries of storytellers had used their minds as the tablets for text, and these people served as progenitors of our culture, no matter that their names and often the stories themselves were lost to history. Pieces of who they were and what they thought remain. So the literature of the Georgia coast is necessarily modern, a manufacture of the people who could read and who could write. The Georgia coast is a stunning place, filled with strange and mysterious environments, clairvoyant beauty, and a splendid diversity of life forms. And these features have inspired a body of literature known for its feelings toward the land. As the scholar Hugh Ruppersberg wrote, Georgia has provided its writers with a context of history and geography, their work an identity grounded in time and place, which out of all the world's literature and history make it distinctive and unique. Thinkers of myriad disciplines, decades now, have attempted to define the human response and relationship to place. J.B. Jackson, a noted American geographer, looking at how human forces shape the environment, wrote in his book, which is Discovering the Vernacular Landscape, that a sense of place is one of the ways in which we identify the peculiar characteristics of a land and its inhabitants. Geographer Yifu Tuan spoke of topophilia, which is that link between a person and place, and cultural anthropologists talk in the same way of place attachment. Poet Richard Wilbur, in an introduction to a book by Alan Gussow, defines sense of place as a fusion of natural and human order, a peculiar window on the whole. And he goes a step further to say a place is a piece of the environment that has been claimed by feelings. We've always heard, about regional writers, and I want to talk just for a minute about the distinction between the two. Regionalism tends to symbolize, and that symbolism overshadows place itself, which ceases to be seen and experienced with clarity. In the South, for example, magnolia blossoms and burning crosses, tradition, family, sweet tea, mint juleps typify the South, but the South is much more complex. Even now, I believe, and this is my latest JAG, I believe that we do a huge disservice to ourselves to continue to mythologize the South as a place of hospitality, of paternity toward non-whites, of farming communities, of innocent agrarians. I believe that symbolism obscures the complexity of the human psyche, and it obstructs fresh responses to the tragedies and trials of our time. Sense of place, contrary to regionalism, infers that a narrator understands the land not as a political region, but as an ecosystem. Rather than ownership, it's being owned. One belongs to a place. Residence is not a matter of property, but placement. Regionalism would imply, poet William Stafford told Lars Nordstrom, a literary critic who was writing a book about these three eco-poets, and I'm skipping a lot of this just because this paper has gotten to be so honorously long, and I'm very afraid that Chris is going to come up and shut me down. So you'll have to get the particulars of it. He said, so this is Stafford saying that the writer of regionalism is deliberately exaggerating the localness of the material. A sense of place would be different because you would not be deliberately exploiting or making hay out of the exoticness of the material. You would just be in it, just be using what is natural to you in your kind of life. Gary Snyder called this the new regionalism or transformed regionalism, and he said, what I am calling new regionalism starts very precisely from sense of place, rejects the necessity for an American identity at all, renames the continent, renames the localities, erases political boundaries, extends the time back. We can dial time backwards until we reach an epoch that predates humans, of course, but the human experience is actually necessary for our conceptualizations of nature. The concept of natural process is an idea that is useful only if one perceives humanity as part of it, wrote Michael Hugh in his book called Out of Place. And Stegner said, so I must believe that, at least to human perception, a place This is really bold. A place is not a place until people have been born in it, have grown up in it, lived in it, died in it, have both experienced and shaped it. I interpret sense of place as the experience of the human body in a landscape, the parallel lines between geography and a life, the effect of the real environment on one's emotional terrain, the intersection of the human heart and the natural world. The body is important in this because I believe that sense of place depends on a host of sensory responses through what is seen, felt, tasted, smelt. I write about senses in Pinhook, not only the 5 primary senses and the 6th sense of intuition, but a host of others: sense of direction, sense of longing, sense of pitch, sense of obligation, sense of danger, sense of being watched, sense of another's presence, sense of hostility, sense of time, sense of place. Call these biochemical triggers, if you will, call them pheromones, no matter. I believe that much information is relayed to us humans on a level more primal than human consciousness. I think that place affects us in this way. A place you love is a drug. I also believe that as we strive to sanitize and civilize and technologize and safeguard our lives, that we lose these this plethora of natural senses, and in doing so, we become weaker creatures. For the purposes of this paper, I could have simply done a compendium of the literature and how it uses sense of place, and I actually do that in some regards, but I thought it would be even more interesting to talk about how a sense of place materializes in a person. And I think that there are 4 ways that can happen, and the first is visual perception. Second is, and I'm going to explain these, the second is experience or other sensory perception. The third is study, scholarship, and the fourth is fidelity, what Buddy Sullivan, Buddy, talked about as permanence. At its most elemental, a sense of place begins with an appreciation of the superficial, the scenery. The vistas move the viewer. As Hugh says, natural scenery has a profound influence on our perception of places. As I go through these, I'm going to start to look at the literature, and I want to talk about the first written accounts of European settlement of the province of Georgia. Some of them trace General James Edward Oglethorpe's voyage from England and his arrival in the New World in 1732. And many are collected in a wonderful volume produced by Beehive Press called Our First Visit in America, Early Reports. Peter Gordon's accounts are in there. He became bailiff and conservator of the peace. He was one of 114 settlers who arrived from Beaufort by Pettiagories and climbed Yamacraw Bluff on February 1st of 32. His Majesty, having by royal charter granted that tract of land lying between the rivers Savannah and Altamahaw. As the country all around us was a continued forest, wrote Gordon at first sight, and nothing to be seen but wood and water. The New World was a blank slate, an empty clay tablet, an unwritten scroll. Something in us loves the world stripped bare. A year later, March 1733, Baron von Reck accompanied the first band of Salzburgers who were headed who founded the town of Ebenezer. He wrote in his journal, "God blessed us this day with the sight of our country, our wished-for Georgia, which we saw at 10 in the morning and brought us unto the Savannah River. This river is in some places broader than the Rhine." And he goes on. Perhaps the most useful and revelatory account comes in A Voyage to Georgia, begun in the year 1735 by Francis Moore, who was in the company of 40 families chosen to settle Frederica. He was storekeeper and recorder. On March 18th, sailing from Savannah down the coast, he writes, "The land seemed high about the middle. It looked pleasant, the beach being white sand, the woods lofty, the land hilly." Experience. As Hugh points out, this preoccupation with scenery limits real understanding and connection to a place, scenery being cursory, superficial. The preoccupation as visual enjoyment is an expression of society's dissociation from nature, he said. It's only through the experience of a place can deeper understandings develop. No place is a place, again, boldly wrote Stegner, until things that have happened in it are remembered in history, ballads, yarns, or monuments. The first thing that happens to a guest on the Georgia coast is heat, abundant sunshine, no-see-ums, high humidity, the movement of water. The first thunderstorm is always a bit shocking. Benjamin Ingham arrived in 1736. 23, he had been a member of Charles and John Wesley's Methodist group at Oxford, and he assumed clerical duties on his journey across the Atlantic. After arriving in the New World, January 25th, he wrote, "Toward evening, we had a terrible storm, which lasted several hours. I observed it well, and truly I never saw anything hitherto so solemn and majestic. The sea sparkled and smoked as if it had been on fire. The air darted forth lightning, and the wind blew so fierce that you could scarce look it in the face and draw your breath." There are a lot of other accounts of thunderstorms by people who are new to Georgia. They're very interesting. I think there's something to be said for a nativity in a place, because you're hearing those thunderstorms in your mom's womb, you know, and so they're not quite so frightening when you're thrust out into the real world. So what we begin to see is we begin to look at the elements of our place, the Georgia coast as a place of violent storms. The third level of a sense of place involves scholarship, which is scholarship of the soils, of archaeology, history, weather, and the most important of those, and the one I'm going to talk about today, being natural history. Thus, we go beyond superficial understanding, science plunging us deeper into layers of meaning, natural history telling us about things we can't see from a distance or without patient observation. And this has led to a new movement in place-based education, understanding that Georgia school children need to learn about our home places as much as the rainforest or the desert. A study of natural history is a study of ecology, which reveals the interrelatedness of all biota. The oyster catcher needs the oyster, which depends on microorganisms, which need the Spartina. The deer depend on the passion flowers, which need the native bees, which depend on cavities in sand, and so on. We begin to understand what Wendell Berry calls the geniuses of our place, precedent to human intention. I'm going to skip a section because a lot of this is done. Thoreau's a great example by walking. Muir, you saw that. Also by just standing still, which there are these amazing accounts of Thoreau, who is, of course, we have our own Thoreau in Bartram, but just accounts of him standing still for hours at a time, watching baby ducks and so forth. So I'm going to skip, there's a list of flora and fauna that can be put together from some of these early writings, especially Moore, but I want to bring out 3 or 4 of them. Moore was especially curious and observant, disciplined in his recording. He wrote, "I observed here a kind of long moss I had never seen before. It grows in great quantities upon the large trees and hangs down 3 or 4 yards from the boughs. It gives a noble, ancient, and hoary look to the woods. It is of a whitish green color, but when dried is black and like horsehair." Place of Spanish moss. More again, "I have seen several snakes which were killed at Frederica, the largest above 2 yards long, the belly white, and the back of brown color. They seem to be of the viper kind, and are of a strong smell. The rattles or rings at the end of their tails of a horny substance. These shaking together make a noise, which with their strong musky smell gives cautious people notice where they are." Place of rattlesnakes. And there are great numbers of squirrels of different sizes. The little kind, the same as in England, a lesser than that, not much bigger than a mouse, and a large gray sword, very near as big as a rabbit, which those who are accustomed to the country say eat as well. And also interesting, the island abounds with deer and rabbits. There are no buffaloes in it, though there are large herds of them upon the main. The Georgia coast as a place of buffalo as well. By far the greatest recorder of natural history during the time of European settlement was the father and son duo, the Bartrams. John Bartram, born in Pennsylvania, 1699, began to grow interesting plants on his farm, and that led to a lifelong devotion to the study of botany and a passion for plants. In his diary, he recorded what he saw, but years later, his son William, born in 1739, followed in his father's footsteps, leaving Philadelphia in 73 on a journey that would last 4 years and take him through 8 southern colonies, resulting in the epic we know today as Bartram's Travels. Its writing is floral, soaring, painstaking, its achievement monumental. He was especially interested in the Georgia coast. He called ours a set of fine islands. And one of my favorite scenes from Travels takes place on St. Simons. He says, "At length I doubled the utmost south point of St. Simons, which forms the north cape of the south channel of the great river Alattamahaw. The Sound, just within this cape, forms an excellent bay or cove on the south end, on the opposite side of which I beheld a house and farm, where I soon arrived." Do y'all know this story? Bartram followed a line of beehives along an avenue and found the good man of the house reclining on a bear skin spread under the shade of a live oak, smoking a pipe. The planter's servant brought the traveler a bowl of honey water and then served a repast of venison. And this is what Bartram wrote: "Our rural table was spread under the shadow of oaks, palms, and sweet bays, fanned by the lively, salubrious breezes wafted from the spicy groves. Our music was the responsive lovelays of the painted nonpareil and the alert and gay mock bird, whilst the brilliant hummingbird darted through the flowery groves. The prose is poetic and ecstatic, evidence of an impressive diction or diversity of language and a tremendous joie de vivre. But perhaps the ecstasy came from the brandy in the honey water." Bartram continues, "But yet how awfully great and sublime is the majestic scene eastward. The solemn sound of the beating surf strikes our ears, the dashing of yon liquid mountains. Like mighty giants, in vain assail the skies. They are beaten back and fall prostrate upon the shores of the trembling island." I would give anything to write like that. I'm going to skip John Muir, and also I just want to briefly mention 2 naturalist brothers, Francis and Roland Harper, who came through, and Francis actually published an annotated edition of both books, William's Travels and John's Diary. And then in 2010, this is worth noting that our own Dorinda Dahlmeyer, who is an environmental ethicist and writer, she again republished the Travels with support from Craig at Wormslow Foundation, this time with a collection of reflections acknowledging the debt Southern nature writers owe the man called the South's Thoreau. I have been particularly fascinated with how people write about the salt marsh. Bartram said there's a large space betwixt this chain of seacoast islands and the main, near 3 leagues in breadth, but all this space is not covered with water. 2/3 of it are low salt plains, which produce barilla, sedge, rushes, etc. In December of 38, Fanny Kimball, and somebody's already talked about her, so I won't say much, but she came with her husband, Pierce Butler, to the Sea Islands. Butler had inherited a couple of years before his grandfather's holdings and property, which included hundreds of slaves, and Kimball was morally opposed to slavery. So during the winter that she arrived, that was 1838 and 39, she faithfully kept a diary. And one day she goes out for a walk. She says, I should like the wild, savage, lonely. No, this is not it. She did say this, I should like the wild, savage loneliness of the faraway existence if it were not for the one small item of the slavery. But that small item contributed to a marital separation in 1845 and divorce in 1849. She writes of her first walk on the island, which was apparently one of the small islands in the mouth of the Altamaha. She says, I got out of the vicinity of the settlement and pursued my way along a narrow dike, the river on one hand, and on the other a slimy, poisonous-looking swamp, all rattling with sedges of enormous height, in which one might lose one's way as effectually as in a forest of oaks. I first saw the salt marsh when I was a child going to church in Brunswick. We passed over one on 341 going in, and I remember my dad looking out, telling us what it was, and beginning to quote a poem that his teachers in grade school had made him memorize in Appling County. I saw it as scenery, but over the years of my life, I have learned it's full of secrets, populated as it is with the marsh periwinkle, the mud snail, the air-breathing coffee bean snail, fiddler crabs, oysters, rib mussels. Clapper rails build their cup-shaped nests of grasses and sedges in clumps of vegetation above the high tide line. They soften their nests with fine strips of grass and often build ramps leading into them. Sometimes they erect canopies over the nests. And March 13th, I think I'll just tell you briefly, a British novelist called Thackeray, he wrote Vanity Fair. This was in 1853. He actually came multiple times to Georgia and Savannah especially, but he was doing a lecture tour. If you read his journals and his letters, he's really all about the money he's going to get on his lectures. But he does say this. He says that Savannah is approached by a red, muddy river like the Nile, with great swampy stretches of gray flats lying to the right and left, Negro houses here and there, and groves of darkling cedars and now and again palmetto trees sprouting up. So Thackeray saw only the mud. The picture we are painting is of the journeyman, journeywoman, the traveler, forming these incipient impressions and then leaving. But the sense of place revealed by a month or by years, even decades, is not the sense of place of generations. And I don't say this because I come from generations of colonizers. I say it as a traveler. The traveler is the duff on the forest floor, sometimes deteriorating and adding its nutrient load, and sometimes blowing away. But I, with utmost humbleness, bow to the humus of history, the strata of knowledge like soil that spans from bedrock to topsoil. With the settler, because memory is the vessel for the stories. Although some of the stories get lost, some of the stories get passed down as part of the inheritance. And whether the storyteller is aware or not, contained within all the new stories are the generations of old ones. The fourth and last that I've recognized as a way of establishing a sense of place is it involves being a stability and sense of an investment in the land because one's well-being and survival depend on it. It's a commitment, a fidelity. If we're lucky, we become native. There are two, I don't know if y'all have heard of Charles Colcock Jones and Charles Colcock Jones Jr. They are the first writers that I can find who were born and died in Georgia along the coast and lived most of their lives here. I'm not going to read the paragraphs about them, but I will say that in the later years of his life, Jones, sort of following what was happening with Joel Chandler Harris, collected 57 oral narratives that he published in a book called Negro Myths of the Georgia Coast. And University of Georgia Press brought this back out in 2000 as Gullah Folk Tales from the Georgia Coast. Inspired by visits to Brunswick in the 60s and 70s, Sidney Lanier, Macon-born attorney, musician, composer, poet, wrote what is arguably the most famous ode to the coast, his magnificent poem, The Marshes of Glen. And what if behind me to westward the wall of the woods stands high? The world lies east, how ample the marsh and the sea and the sky. A league and a league of marsh grass, waist high, broad in the blade, green and all of a height, and unflecked with a light or a shade, stretched leisurely off in a pleasant plain to the terminal blue of the main. Oh, what is abroad in the marsh and the terminal sea? Somehow my soul seems suddenly free from the weighing of fate and the sad discussion of sin by the length and the breadth and the sweep of the marshes of Glen. Stegner, the poet, the guy was just so brutally bold in this essay, but he said, no place is a place until it has had a poet. No place, not even a wild place, is a place until it has had that human attention that at its highest reach we will call poetry. And if you believe that, as I do, then we can say that the Georgia coast was not a place until Sidney Lanier came to visit. Let's skip Conrad Aiken, not because I don't like him, but most of his work had nothing to do with the Georgia coast. One of the most interesting writers is a woman born in Charleston, West Virginia in 1916, who would fall in love with the Golden Isles in 61 during a book tour, and who would spend the rest of her life researching and telling the stories in a fiction startlingly faithful to real life. Eugenia Price was a woman besmitten with a place. This love borne out in book after book, hundreds of pages. Her most famous is a trilogy consisting of 3 historical novels. Sit down, if you can find a place, she wrote, try this chair by the window where you can behold our glorious sunset over our glorious marsh. She died on St. Simon's in 66. I am not an academician, I am a writer, and this is not a comprehensive compendium. This is really the beginning. I get to go back and edit and do more. Listening to other lectures this week, these couple of days, I have added a few writers, and because I have a few weeks before I have to submit the paper to Dr. Sutter, I would love to hear any ideas you have of additions. I know now the 1837 guidebook of the Intercoastal, Frederick Olmsted's Cotton Kingdom, Drums and Shadows, Goulding's Young Marooners. Other writers with varying degrees of place-basedness should be mentioned. Flannery O'Connor, born in Savannah, but whose work is distinctly backcountry, as Albert said. Into the present, John Barrant with his Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, Buddy Sullivan with many environmental histories, including early days on the Georgia Tidewater, Tina McElroy Anza, a resident of St. Simon's, although her books center around the make-believe town of Mulberry, Georgia, similar to the Macon of her childhood. The Naturalist Guides of Taylor Shuttle, Mallory Pierce, and others. The book Life Traces on the Georgia Coast by Anthony J. Martin, who also is here, by the way. Maps are important to a sense of place. First are literal maps by which we navigate the terrain. The construction of them, the discoveries, add to our knowledge of our places. I found interesting in Francis Moore's journals from Frederica, where a certain party had, pursuant to their orders, surveyed from Savannah to Darien and made a plan of it. They had found the country passable for horses, but to keep the horse road, they were obliged to go round. Therefore, that road was 90 miles, but that the road might be carried so as to make it 70. And there were 2 rivers to be swam over and some boggy places. The news, he wrote, they brought had been no small joy to the people of Frederica, since now they had a communication from the Darien by land, open to Savannah, and consequently to all the English colonies of North America. So here we see the map being constructed. Equally important are the maps drawn in one's head. In many ways, a sense of place is simply this abstract map, at first blank, and increasingly filled with greater depth and width and detail. And with what is it filled? With the sights we've seen, experiences, the stories we've heard, the narratives we've read, the ground truthing. It's filled with the names of places. And I think this is why humans love maps. We're so place-oriented. I want to just speak a minute about place names that prior to human habitation, the Georgia coast, with its beach marsh, its string of golden islands like jewels, its ancient forests and artesian wells, stretched southward without nomenclature. Just as the American continent stretched west without names. It had no places in it, Stegner wrote, until people had named them. The names people give places imbue them with symbolic significance that unnamed places lack. The names of places, and for that matter, most things we value, are the essential and powerful features of their identity and how they are understood. Not only do names provide symbols, they imply familiarity, they conjure the skeletons of memory, which is narrative. A name contains a story. As we talk about maps and a sense of place, we have to acknowledge the loss of vocabulary, of common nouns that have added greatly to revelations about place. This language implies accuracy and connection. So it's the common language of rural topography, that vocabulary of dell, swale, and coppice that Thomas Hardy used well, fallen into disuse so that we are relatively speechless before the landscape. Freshet, bow, vale, tarn, zephyr, virgin mold, hamlet, hummocks, shingle, seawall, cliff, seafront, promenade. Shakespeare had, in computer analyses, Shakespeare had a vocabulary of 26,000 words, Hemingway 6,000. What does this say for the age of the tweet? To make way for modern tech terms such as blog, voicemail, and broadband, this is an aside, in 2009, the Oxford Junior Dictionary opted to drop terms pertaining to nature, to old nature, they called it. No longer can a child check this dictionary and learn more about the blackberry, dandelion, acorn, heron, otter, magpie, willow. So we have to speak about the loss of language. The Georgia coast, and I'm almost done here, was colonized by displaced persons. And we have not been able to take the motion out of ourselves. So that the settling of America was almost immediately followed by what Wendell Berry calls the unsettling of America. Except in beloved places, chosen places like coast, which continue to be settled. For a brief century or two, we endured or enjoyed a period of agrarian landedness, but that era has ended, and we Americans have become, for the most part, a placeless, thus homeless people. 4/5 of us now live in cities, not close to the land at all. In our short lives, we have witnessed, all of us, a war against nature. In this regard, I think we suffer from PTSD, or more realistically, present traumatic stress. I believe nature is that important to us. But it didn't start out as a war, just as self-centeredness, human-centeredness, Anthropocene, ignorance of a place because we came from somewhere else. In the hands of planners and developers, our places look more and more homogeneous. They change so fast that our memories fall away, leaving us on shifting sands, longing for lifeways some of us never knew, or perplexing nostalgia, trying to make sense of it all. Communities lose their memory along with their character. Fewer of us then are getting out in the nature that's left. We have seen, according to Richard Louv, the last child in the woods. We live in places, of course, and we travel between places, but they have little further significance. Our ties are financial or human or default. We simply find ourselves there. We urge restlessness on our children. If they are to be successful, they should leave the places where they are born. To return is failure. Most of us, with no real connections to the landscape, don't know the texture and fertility of the soil. Frost harden upon non-native grasses without our keen. A certain arrangement of clouds means little. Even the common names of the birds and insects and reptiles are lost. I believe that we lose part of our humanness when we lose our engagement to place. I believe that it's essential to know and understand the cycles of seasons, moons, weather, tides, and all the things that connect us to the 10,000 generations that were here before there were cell phones. As a human, it's important to understand that we humans too are biological, absolutely dependent on the earth for survival. The highest and best use for a piece of land are its natural processes on which we're all dependent for health and life. The South was hard hit environmentally. The area of natural forest across the South has declined from 356 million acres colonially to 182 today, and that figure is actually inaccurate. It's being counted inaccurately. 14 ecosystems across the South have declined to occupy only 2% of their original range. By 95, 99% of the longleaf pine was gone. There are more threatened forested ecosystems in the South than any other region. Half of the wetlands, meaning swamps, have been lost. People are attracted to coastlines, and development begins to destroy them. There's constant pressure on Jekyll, challenging its protections. Some parts of Jekyll unrecognizable to the eldest among us. The marsh is continually assaulted, filled for road projects, for houses, bulldozed for docks. The Marshland Protection Act gutted. Preserving the wilderness on Cumberland is a continual battle. Protecting all of it is a battle. Southerners have been typified as deeply faithful, hospitable, devoted to family, loyal to home. Our qualities include a reverence for history and a strong sense of place, yet this place, this homeland, is vanishing. What will happen to our sense of ourselves? As the Georgia landscape changes, so too what it means to be Georgian, especially a Georgia writer, changes. What kind of doom does it spell for our culture if we destroy 99% of a landscape that engenders it, or 98%? Does the culture become urban, streetwise, irrelevant, disloyal? Does it turn its back on family, history, and place? Does the literature, as Reynolds Price suggested, consist of bad poems and novels full of neon light on wet asphalt, unshaven chins, scalding coffee at 4 a.m.? Is this the danger, that we lose a culture that has defined us and so must, through our literature, reinvent ourselves? American culture has focused on opportunity and abundance, the new frontier always ahead. Half a millennium has passed since Europeans first laid eyes on this place. But now the frontiers have been crossed. Perhaps it's time we settled down. Perhaps it's time as a country and as a region to grow up. Perhaps it's time to be domestic, to pay attention to our home. Perhaps it's time to let the love in our hearts guide our actions. Thank you.
You can't cut off that kind of poetry, can you? We have time for just a few questions, I think, for Janice, if you're able to take. Right here.
My least favorite part. I have to think on my feet. Thank you all again for coming. Isn't it just amazing to have all of us in one room? This is really studying place right here. This is exactly what we're talking about.
This is a very simple question that I work with all the time, and that is, what you're talking about, is it just nostalgia?
Wait, ask me that again?
When I talk the way you do, my friends say, "Oh, that's just nostalgia."
Oh, yeah.
How would you react to that? I mean, I suppose someone not familiar with our environment and not affixed to it, they might say that.
Oh, I'm sure they do. I think that until you've known a true relationship to place, and until you appreciate place in the same way that some of the northern industrialists coming down to the Sea Islands did, until you stand in honor before it and obedience, until you patiently, like crawfish, watch what's happening, I think it would be easy to dismiss it as nostalgia. I will say again, as I said in the talk, I believe that part of being fully human, part of our philosophical humanness is that we know our places, that we are attached to the cycles of our places, the biota, the life forms there, that we honor other life forms besides our own. All you can do with a question like that is get on the defensive. Like, anybody else? Right there, and then we'll stop there. Yours. Oh.
Part of your talk made me very sad, because I do believe that in this generation, and maybe generations, or the present generation and generations to come, their sense of place is what's, the mechanism that's between their two hands, because they are tweeting and sitting in front of TVs and by themselves and at the computer and alone and inside. And I think that is a real concern. And we're losing our ability to be in nature and to enjoy nature, and also we're losing our connection with each other, which I think is a sense of place, and that the power of story is leaving, and it's kind of scary.
I hear you. I got to just tell you this about hope, which I didn't intend to say, but, there's a lot to be hopeless about. And I think that we should not focus on hopelessness, that we should I was interviewed earlier today by Emory with this digital atlas project, and they asked me about hope. And I honestly believe this, that, in the face of a pretty dismal outlook for the earth, because of climate change and toxification and all the other things that you know about, that it would be easy to just give up. But people ask me how I stay hopeful. I say to them, hope does not matter to me. I don't think, this is a terrible metaphor, but it's the one I use, which is, do you quit feeding your asthmatic daughter or your lymphoma-ridden child because there's little hope they're going to survive it? Of course you don't. We act because of love. So the question is not, how do I keep hopeful? Hopelessness implies paralysis, which is inaction. It's staying in your bed all day, but you're here. Hope, I really think that we should replace hope with love, and it's just a matter of I really think it's a matter of just trying to be beacons of love and do all you can. And sometimes people say to me, what can I do? And I say, just get together with your neighbors and talk. So you're exactly right. We're facing a lot of losses of our culture. This culture has meant a lot to us, but I don't think it's what we have to accept. I think we can hang on to it. Thank you. Thank you all.